3, 2, 1, go. Hello, people. Oh, what am I doing? Here we go. I can see this.
I'm never gonna
No, I
get
can't.
tired of these cold opens, Colleen. They just keep getting better. Hello.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our last session. Hello. That's because sometimes I don't know what I'm doing in the sense of, never mind. I'm just this. Accept me as I am, everybody. This is our last session. I know you all are going to miss me every Tuesday. It's fine. You can catch me on Fridays, though, for our community session. I know some people I see there. Okay, wow, look at all these people filtering in. Welcome. Hello, 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 my friends. Who is, or do we all have attendees? How many people are coming back? How many people have attended a session? This is number 6. Last but not least, last time you get to see all of our wonderful faces on a Tuesday at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Look at me, brand new, Teresa Jefferson. How's it going? 6 for you, Michael. Wow, Edwin, you too. Cody, I'm back, brand new. 5 for Ralph, Charles, 3, Stephen, all seasoned veteran out here. Thank you, Brandon. This is so exciting. Does anyone have a favorite session that they've had?
Good question.
Favorite session. I just hit my mic. I'm sorry. Number 1 was your favorite. Interesting. All of them. 2. Okay. Everybody else? Edwin just says all of them. Edwin, that's cheating. You have to pick one. Or are these archived somewhere? I'd love to view. Yes, Teresa. I will send you a link to all of them after we kick things off. So that way you have it. Because if I try to do it now, I might mess up my entire screen. Edwin, number 6, accumulate. You haven't even taken this one yet. How do you know what's your favorite? It's like when my nephew gives me, I'm like, here's your Christmas gift. Oh, thank you. I love it so much. I'm like, you haven't even opened it yet. How do you know you love it so much?
It's like the avocado kid.
On avocado. Yeah, everyone's really enjoying my cold opens. Oh, I'm excited to see all of your names because I can't see your faces. So thank you all for coming back again. We've missed you. Of course you have. It was a long weekend here in Canada. Do we have any fellow Canadians on the call? Enjoy your long weekend. I think the US holiday is the Friday off, I think. Monday. Okay. Memorial Day for us. Okay, so never mind. Oh, what am I doing now? Okay, maybe I'll wait 1 more minute before we kick things off.
It looks like we're ready to rock and roll. I want to make sure we have lots of time for Q&A.
Okay.
So I feel like we should just.
So I don't even want to wait 1 more minute. Marcel, like, let's get going. So workshop number 6, everyone. Oh, who's pumped? Who's learned so much? Me, I can't see your hands raised, but I know you've all learned so much. Workshop number 6, strategies to reduce risk and increase reward. Oh, goodness gracious, every time. There we go. So this is your first time, Teresa. My name is Colleen McGrath. I'm the Senior Manager of Community here at Vendasta. I've been here for about 3.5 years, and I have been so honored and blessed to host all these workshops alongside Marcel and Vish. So Marcel Petapa, the legendary CEO and co-founder of Parakeeto. It's a company dedicated to helping agencies measure and improve their profitability by streamlining their operations and reporting systems. I should do stand-up, Tim. No one wants to see that. He's also the fractional COO at Goldfront, an award-winning creative agency in the beautiful San Francisco, working with brands like Uber, Slack, Keep, and more. He is also the head strategic coach at SaaS Academy by Dan Martell, and it's the #1 coaching program for B2B SaaS businesses in the world. So for the last time, we get to see Marcel. I get to do that fantastic introduction, who's all been able to hear it all 6 times. So I will say this is part of our Conquer Local ecosystem. We have our academy, our podcast, and our community. In the community, you can see all of our recordings. You can explore the community threads. We have our group. Marcel is in there every so often to answer any other questions. So Vish is going to share a link to our academy right now. That way you can go back and watch them all for a second time, maybe a third, maybe you need a little bit more, maybe you need a refresher, which is the exciting stuff. So you can go back. So even if you don't get to see us live every Tuesday now, you still can get all those juicy nuggets. So last time, Marcel Pettipa, please take the stage.
Thank you, Colleen. It's great to be back one last time. We're going 6 for 6 here. Thank you, everyone that has joined all the sessions so far. Great to see how many of you have been able to consume all of these in real time as we go through. And hopefully you've all been able to apply some of what you've learned so far and start seeing some results in your business. So as Colleen mentioned, today is session 6, and it's all about really kind of putting the pieces together and really talking about how we use some of the elements that we've learned over the first 5 sessions to start looking into the future, which really allows us to decrease risk and get better rewards out of our business. And so as a reminder, I'm Marcel. This is what I do. I help agencies run more profitably. I do it at Parakeeto every day, where we specialize in doing this for agencies. I'm also practicing this in the weeds at Goldfront at scale, as well as on our podcast, the Agency Profit Podcast, where we talk about, you guessed it, agency profitability. So if you like what you're hearing during these sessions, then make sure you subscribe to the show so you can stay up to date on our latest thinking. And I get to do lots of this, lots of speaking, lots of training. So make sure that you subscribe to our newsletter if you want to hear about other events like this that I'm going to be speaking at, other webinars, other times when you're going to be able to hear from me. Hopefully there'll be lots more of this kind of stuff that we can do together at Vendasta, but this is how I spend the majority of my time, is just out here shaking hands, kissing babies, and spreading the gospel of agency profitability. So hopefully you can catch me in some other spots. So as a reminder, Parakeeto helps agencies measure and improve their profitability. This is all we do. This is what we've been doing for almost 5 years now. And we're very qualified to do it, in my opinion, because we've applied our methodology to hundreds of different agencies of all different types of sizes, business models, et cetera. And it always works. It always works. And in fact, it works so well that most of our long-term clients experience a 200+% increase in their profitability and 3 times higher profit margins than average, while maintaining strong growth. Most of our clients are growing 50, 60, 70% year over year while still having industry-leading profitability. So yeah, this is what we do, and we're pretty damn good at it. So on that note, I want to reiterate the problems if you're new here that we've kind of been working through over 6 sessions, and remind everyone that the recordings of all of these sessions are available in the Conquer Local community, which Vish has shared the instructions to get access to. So if you want to go back and watch the previous sessions, some of this today might be over your head because we're pulling from those previous sessions. So don't get concerned if that's the case. You can go back and get up to speed. All of those recordings are going to be available. And I'm also, like Colleen mentioned, in the group, answering questions that might come up to fill in the gaps in that group in the community. So with that, if you've been struggling with not really having a clear vision and strategy for how to measure your agency's operations, we've been covering that throughout the sessions. If we've been struggling with having messy data and systems and finding it hard to answer these questions, even though you know the data is around, but it's just maybe not structured properly, or it's spread out in different places, or you're just not sure how to put it all together or how to calculate things accurately, we've talked through a lot of that. And finally, guessing and stressing. This is what we're really going to dive into today and talk about how to use the building blocks that we've discussed over the last few sessions and use those to forecast into the future. So as a refresher, we have covered core financials. We did this in the second session. We went deep on core financials. We covered earning efficiency, utilization, and we talked about scoping accuracy over the last couple of sessions. And today we're going to be talking about forecasting and how to just apply some simple abstractions to what we've discussed and use it to project into the future. The first thing that I want to kind of refresh everybody on is the most basic form of forecasting, which is just taking our capacity, utilization, and average billable rate numbers and using them to model specific periods of time and specific subsections of the business. So now that we're clear on, over the last few sessions, how to calculate somebody's capacity or a group of people's capacity, We've talked about the formula for utilization. We've talked about how to figure out average billable rate. If we have some data on this, doesn't take a whole lot. What we can start to do is look at any time period into the future and start to get a handle on what our revenue targets should look like and how our revenue or our profitability changes as we dial in our targets for these different metrics. So this is a simple illustration of how, let's assume that we are looking at, it's called the next quarter, and we're looking at a specific department within our agency that has a capacity of 10,000 hours across the whole team. We can start to apply a utilization and average billable rate to that team and get clarity on how much income that team can handle in that period of time. And we can also have a look at how that changes if we improve our average billable rate, right? How much additional revenue we can be adding, therefore profitability. And then similarly, as we improve our utilization, how that also impacts AGI. So this is the simplest form of forecasting and the purest form of forecasting. It only needs three very simple ingredients: capacity that we measure or model in a given period of time for our team, a utilization rate, and average billable rate. That gives us the power to start looking into the future and getting an understanding of how much do we need to sell? What does this need to look like? Or what does it look like if we improve our performance in these ways? We've already talked about that, so I want to take it a step further. The next thing I want to talk about is something called cost performance indexing. So this is the question of forecasting at the project level. So you might be partway through a project or partway through an engagement with a client, and you can use, again, these simple building blocks that we've already discussed. If we have the AGI and we have the planned hours for a project, we can start to project our ABR. And the way that we do that is by simply adding in a % complete formula to our average billable rate measurement, which allows us to formulate an assumption or a projection about what the average billable rate is going to look like and how many hours are going to be required at the end of a project, even if we're only a couple of days or a couple of weeks in. And the way that we do that is using the following formula. We take our planned hours. By the way, this is a very common project management formula. It's not a new concept, certainly not one that I invented. So if you are a certified project manager, if you've done any formal project management training, you might be familiar with this. And there's lots of great documentation on the internet, and lots of great templates and so on to help you do this. So we take our planned hours and we divide that by planned hours times % complete divided by actual hours. And essentially what we're doing is we're looking at what is the % complete, what are the number of hours that we've used, and what is the delta essentially between where we should be and where we actually are. And then we multiply our planned hours by that delta, and that helps us project roughly where we're going to end up in the future if we maintain this current level of efficiency. And so again, just adding a simple, well, air quotes, simple % complete number here to our average billable rate reporting allows us to start doing forward-looking projections. Now, this is where there is a bit of nuance. How do you figure out the % complete of a project? There isn't a great answer to this, but it's something that I want to stop and impress upon everyone as being very important. If you have an accountant that's doing accrual accounting for you, but you've never had a discussion with that accountant about how you are actually recognizing the % complete of revenue, that's a red flag, and it's probably a conversation you need to have, because how do they know what % complete your projects are at any given period of time? Are you giving them that information? And if you are, do you have a consistent framework for coming up with it? There's basically 4 ways to do that. The first is we do it using hours versus budget. So as an example, if I have 100 hours in the budget and I've used 50, then I'm 50% done. This works reasonably well for hourly kind of well-scoped projects, but there are some challenges with this where if all of a sudden you start having to go over budget on a project, then you're 100% complete for quite some time. And so it's not necessarily the most accurate way to do this, but it can work. The next one is looking at essentially the timeline versus time. So if we have a 5-week project and we've used 2.5 weeks, or we're 2.5 weeks into that project and we're 50% done that project. So where are we in the timeline relative to the overall timeline of the project? This works really well if you are very tight about timelines and you rarely miss them, and you have a fairly linear way of earning revenue across your projects. The last way of doing this is tasks versus total. So this works particularly well if you're doing some kind of agile development process, or you're doing some process by which you are assigning efforts or points to tasks, and then you are very, very diligent about project management, where every time something's getting done, your team is checking it off, in which case you might have 100 points worth of work to do on a project. You've completed 50 of those points, therefore you're 50% done. And then the last one is subjective, which I know sounds like it's going to be the worst out of all of these, but if you have a lot of variation and not a whole lot of consistency in the way that revenue gets earned on projects, or you don't have a lot of consistency in terms of how things get managed and measured across different departments in your team, having your project managers who have a finger on the pulse use all three of these to try and triangulate roughly what percent complete a project is, and then applying their subjective lens to that last little judgment can actually be the most accurate way to do this and doesn't gate it necessarily behind a big process. So these are the 4 ways to figure out percent complete. All of them have problems. None of them are going to be perfect, but what's important is what's going to fit best within the way that you operate. But it's important to kind of pick one of these, standardize that process, and then make sure that your percent complete is being consistently generated for not only this report, but also your accrual accounting. So this is one other simple way that we can start to look into the future on a project or client level, just by applying, again, the concept of percent complete here to our already kind of standard AGI, hours, and average billable rate measurement, which we learned about in the 3rd session, I believe, of this series. The next thing I want to spend a little bit of time talking about, and this is a bit of an audible from the original plan for today, but I think it's important, is forecasting capacity. This is probably one of the most important questions that come up, especially as agencies start to cross over that 20, 30 person headcount. Forecasting people becomes very quickly the most important and the most pressing question, because you're at a scale where you're probably now hiring a few people every month, or you have turnover every single month. And so decisions about, do we hire this person? When do we onboard them? When are we going to need to put this job post up? Because there's all this significant lag around hiring and onboarding, becomes really, really key. Drop my pencil. Give me a moment. I dropped my pencil. My glasses fell off, and now we're good. Okay, that was so graceful. So let's talk about capacity forecasting, because the challenge that I see so many agencies run into here is they become blocked by bottom-up forecasting, which is the way that people typically think about this. So when we think about capacity forecasting, there's 2 ways to do it, and most people never consider the second way, capacity forecasting. So the first way is the way that most people think about it, which is bottom up. So the good thing about bottom up is it's very precise. We're usually using a whole bunch of we're taking an estimate. So we take an estimate, we break it down to tasks, specific tasks. We then assign those tasks to people, and then people build up to departments or segments. So this is the general process for bottom-up resource planning or forecasting. So of course, this is very precise because we're breaking everything down to the task level, and then we're assigning it to individuals, and then we can see what every single person's capacity looks like. The problem with this is it's very, very slow and expensive and painful, and it really is not very timely. If we have something that's fairly early in the sales process, it actually might not be very accurate either. Although it's precise, it might not be accurate because we might not actually have great assumptions about what the scope of a project is. And so if we're sitting in a leadership meeting and we're trying to figure out, do we need to go find some freelance designers, or do we need to put up a job post for a designer if this deal closes and that deal closes? We don't really have time to kick that estimate off to our project management team and have them break it down to tasks, assign those tasks to people, and go through this very, very rigid process. And so the other way to do this is what I call top-down capacity forecasting, where we're using the things that we learned about in scoping accuracy earlier, right, which is using historical data to create these very accurate models of how much time it's going to take at a departmental level to estimate things. And then what we're able to do is take our pipeline, run that through our scoping models, and put that straight into a capacity forecast. Because if we know, for example, that for every dollar of website budget that a client has, it adds 0.2 hours of project management time, 1 hour of design time, and 2 hours of development time to the scope of work, then we can simply tag a deal in the pipeline with dollars and project type, and then connect that to our scoping models, and then pipe that directly into a capacity forecast. And in a matter of minutes, or sometimes even seconds, if we have really good scoping models, we can start to in real time say, if this deal closes, then we need to hire a designer. If it doesn't, then we're probably good. And that's how fast we can start to get to this data. It's slightly less precise. I would argue that it's just as accurate. We're not going to know at an individual level, but if we have reasonably well-defined kind of departments or categories for our people, then we can start to, at a higher level, get insight that is more helpful in that situation. And we don't have to be gated by bottom-up forecasting. And the nice thing about this is we can do both. It's just a question of when does it become appropriate to take on all the cost of bottom-up forecasting. And usually that's a project lifecycle question. I would argue that it becomes appropriate once a deal closes and that whole process of kicking it off to a project and account management team is instigated, and then they can take it that extra mile and start assigning it out to individual people. But before that, it's just a lot of effort to get to the same level of insight that we can achieve with top-down. So in practice, what this actually looks like for top-down forecasting is something like this, where we have our pipeline, right? We have client A, they're doing an 8K a month retainer. We have client B, they're doing a 150K website. We have client C, they're doing a 35K brand. And then we might say, okay, what if we close the website and the brand, but we don't close the retainer? We run those things through a scoping model, and then it can output something that looks like this. Okay, if we close those two deals, but we don't close the other one, our design team will be at 105%, our copywriting team will be at 72%, our project management team will be at 91% capacity, in the next whatever time period. So this more abstracted, simpler way of achieving this outcome, I think is really powerful and doesn't require a whole lot of inputs or a whole lot of complexity to do. So this is another really, really important idea, right? Is getting away from bottom-up forecasting and going more to top down, and using all of the building blocks that we've discussed before, this becomes much more achievable. And so here's an example of what this looks like for one of our clients, as an example, where we can say, okay, what is our delivery team, which is their project management team's capacity in the next, few weeks? How is that changing over time? And then based on the projects that we have in the pipeline, what is this looking like? And then again, being able to check or uncheck projects from that list and see in real time how that might affect the team's capacity. So this is what becomes available with very, very little friction when we think about going top down on forecasting. So that's another big concept. And then similarly, we can use the same kind of scoping models concept to forecast our other metrics, right? Utilization, average billable rate, AGI. If we know early on in a sales process what the AGI of a project is going to look like, roughly how many hours it's going to use from our scoping models, then we can also start to forecast into the future in terms of what is our average billable rate going to look like if we hit the targets on this project, what AGI going to look like. So all of these things can kind of come into alignment because we've really simplified the schema down to these couple of core building blocks. And the last thing that we can do here is actually start to get a sense of our elasticity and the use of freelancers that's necessary in our business. So this is a question that I get asked a lot, which is, when should I hire versus hire a freelancer? How do I kind of measure this? And there's a concept for this. It's called capacity elasticity. And so this is really about tracking utilization and the fluctuation in that utilization. It really comes down to how wide is that wavelength? And you can actually start to break that down at a departmental level. So let's say, for example, you're looking at your design department and you're seeing, okay, we're consistently under 60% utilization. And we also have high pipeline volatility. So deals aren't closing very consistently, or some deals, there's a lot of design work, other deals, there's almost no design work. And we're seeing that our wavelength for utilization in the design department is very much up and down. And so that would be a good indication that we need to maintain a high degree of elasticity. in design based on the shape of the curve for utilization and the amount of the consistency with which we're underneath our utilization target. That would mean that, okay, we want to just keep a deep bench of freelancers here. We probably want to avoid hiring full time for the moment because there's too much volatility there for us to really handle that hire and actually have it come out being more profitable. Last couple of things I want to touch on here, we'll remind everybody about is precision versus accuracy. So all of these things I think start to allude back to this concept that I talked about on our last call, which is, ultimately what we're trying to do is get to accuracy, right? We want to be making decisions that we're confident about, and we conflate that with being precise, right? Being very detailed in our analysis. And the reality is that often precision does not lead to additional accuracy, and it can sometimes undermine accuracy. So remember that the more precise we get, there's this diminishing return that starts to occur where the additional precision and therefore cost that we add to our reporting does not actually end up helping us get that much more accurate. And we want to identify where that point of diminishing returns is. And at the simplest form, non-financial reporting comes down to 3 simple models. And if we keep them simple, then it can actually be very easy and quick to do all of the things that I just described. And so that model is these 3 important building blocks. We essentially need a project grid. So a table that contains information about our projects. And at its foundation, this is very simple. It's what's the revenue? How many hours do we have planned? And then we might break those hours down into a couple of buckets for the departments that we want to measure or forecast utilization against. So how many design hours, copywriting hours, development hours, et cetera, as an example. We need a people grid, which essentially just maintains a record of who's on the team and what is their capacity across those different buckets of time. And then we need time data, which just measures how much time did we log against each of the projects and against what kind of task categories. And if we have those 3 pieces of data, then we can start to do all kinds of very useful things. We can very easily measure utilization because, as we remember, utilization is a function of capacity versus actual hours billed. So we have everything we need if we have the people grid and the time data. We can also start to forecast capacity because we have, again, a project grid, which contains information about our expectations about projects. And now we have all the information that we need about capacity to put those things together. And we can also start to do ABR reporting as well as ABR forecasting. And so just with these 3 kind of basic assets, 3 tables of data, 1 table about our projects, 1 table about our people, and then our time tracking data, we can combine those things together to start to get all of our key insights in the business. We can start to get, again, our utilization reporting. We can start to forecast our capacity and see into the future. And we can start to do average billable rate reporting as well as average billable rate forecasting just with these 3 pieces of information, as long as they're structured in a way where they're all reasonably aligned, right? The data is structured in a similar way so that all of this reporting becomes easy. That's what it all comes down to when it comes to forecasting and really putting the pieces together. So I know that for those of you that were not on the previous sessions, this probably flew right over your head. So I encourage you to go into the community, the Vendasta community, watch the replays, and this will all make a lot more sense. But with that, I wanted to leave lots of time for questions today. So hopefully we do have some time here and we can jump in and really unpack questions that have come up, not just about today's session, but about any of the sessions and about agency profitability in general. And before we do that, I just want to remind everyone that I've put together more great resources here, including free templates, checklists, and training videos in the profitability toolkit. And you can grab that for free at parakeeto.com/toolkit. And that has everything that you need to get the basics in place, start measuring the essentials in your agency. So I encourage you all to go grab a free copy. And with that, I will turn it back over to Colleen so we can answer some outstanding questions here and bring this 6-part series to a close.
Whoop, whoop. Thank you, Marcel. Before we jump into questions, I just want to mention that everyone attending the last workshop, you'll be receiving first access to the agency profitability ebook that Vendasta is partnering with Marcel to make. So it contains all of Marcel's secrets, herbs and spices for profitability success, and bonus tips, tricks, and formula that are beyond what we discussed today. So it is hot off the press, and attendees will get first dibs on it. So with that, I'm going to open the floor for questions, drop them in the chat. I would just like to take a moment right now to say thank you, Marcel, for joining everyone and showcasing all this incredible knowledge that you have to share. So thank you very much from myself and Vish and Vendasta. So let's talk questions, everybody. There was a question dropped in the Q&A, and it was from Daryl. Daryl, I just sent you a message, so you can click on that link there. A little bit easier for you. Okay, questions. Let me just scroll back through the chat in case somebody has submitted it through there. I know, really great singing. You're welcome, everybody. Wow, I don't actually see any questions. Really?
I mean, maybe I have, yeah.
Did you scare everybody away?
The most elusive topic that I've discussed is the scoping and estimating models. Can you provide a hypothetical example of how we could organize and set up that model? Okay, great question. Damien, you also have a question. And plot data, please. Okay, Brandon. So we talked a little bit about this on the last call, but I'll kind of walk through this. Essentially, the idea here is that we have this kind of graph here. And in many ways, this is what we're all kind of trying to do on a discovery call with a client. We usually have some kind of a scoping metric. And for most of us, this is going to be budget, but there's lots of other things that we could be paying attention to that impact the complexity, essentially, of a project, right? So how many web pages does a person need? How many custom widgets do they need done? How many words do they need in their content, right? Different service offerings might have different scoping metrics. And then, and these are generally the kinds of things that we're trying to get our arms around in the discovery process, so we can get a sense of what is the complexity, right? This speaks to complexity of a given engagement. And then we have the effort that's required. And this is usually measured in terms of hours, but if you're doing Agile, this might be story points or something like that. So this is effort. And this is usually measured in terms of hours. And what we're all trying to essentially figure out is what is the relationship between those two things, right? So the more complex a project gets, the more web pages somebody needs, the more budget they have, whatever. How does that actually impact the amount of time and therefore cost that is required for us to do this work? And that relationship line can be developed just by measuring these two things in a standard way. So if every single project we're measuring the value of the scoping metric as well as the effort that was required to complete it, then we can start to put these kind of dots on the graph, right? So all of these become projects. And what's more is if we are organizing this in such a way that we are, for example, on every single project, not only measuring the total amount of time against the scoping metric, but we're also breaking that time down into buckets like how much project management, design, copywriting time, we're standardizing those buckets, then we can actually start to run this analysis at more detailed levels. That's where the scoping model gets more interesting. But as we add data to this, then we develop a relationship line. And we can start to basically build a model for, if I have 3 core questions, 5 core questions that I ask in discovery, I can quantify the value of complexity for those answers, and I can plug that into a scoping model. Then I can start to have it return to me the amount of time that's required for a given project. So for example, if this is broken down into, I'm looking at in this case, let's say design hours for a website, design hours for web projects. And I figure out, okay, the client is going to require about this much budget. Let's call it 50K. That's about here. Then I can kind of start to triangulate, okay, it's going to take roughly this many hours. I can apply some contingency to that, but very quickly I can start to get in the ballpark, and this becomes very formulaic. And this is just really a question of collecting data. Now, the other thing that you might find is that, well, what if our data is all over the place? What if there's no consistency to this at all? And that's very possible. You might find that there's more consistency to this than you would imagine. But if that is the case, the other thing that you can do is start to apply these rails that push the distribution closer to the middle. And this is process, right? More clearly defined process. If you start to notice a ton of splay in the distribution of data on this graph, then that tells you that you probably need a tighter process or more deliberate scoping in order to start normalizing the distribution of data across this kind of a visualization. So hopefully that gives you a sense, Brandon, of how this might work. Yeah. So
Awesome.
your scoping metric for software development is probably going to have something to do with story points or whatever you're doing to quantify efforts, and figure out the amount of essentially the amount of complexity for a client engagement. The other thing too is, if you didn't watch session 4, Brandon, on pricing models, another thing that you may need to consider is actually just adapting your pricing model so that you can absorb a lot of risk in a client engagement and not have it affect your profitability. So that really comes down to designing your contracts to share risk with the client using time materials or abstracted time materials. So hopefully that helps answer your question. It's a very good one. And we go deeper on this, and I think it's session 3 or 4. They're all kind of turning into one for me, but go watch the replays. And I talk about this at length in another one as well.
He
What
says,
is
thanks,
the system?
mate.
Yeah, you're welcome, Brandon. Great question.
Thanks, mate. Damien asks, what is the system you are using to track productivity?
Right. So Damien, good question. So I'm going to assume that when you talk about productivity, you mean to track time. I'm currently using Harvest, but to be honest with you, I don't have very strong opinions about time tracking tools, because I never expect any of them to be good at reporting, and I never do any reporting inside of the time tracking tool because they're all bad at it. So I look at it purely as a tool to collect information from my team. I like Harvest because it has lots of different ways to do that. It's reasonably flexible in its hierarchy, but just about every time tracking tool has the same hierarchy when you look at it at the API level. So I don't really have strong opinions about time tracking tools. I personally use Harvest and like it, but I like EverHour. I like Toggle. I'm a fan of QuickTime. I think there's lots of good ones out there, and I think they're all fine as long as they're used in the correct way. In terms of measuring productivity, that's a little bit more nuanced. I need to understand what you mean by that, but I'm assuming that you mean just tracking time. Productivity is kind of another more abstract question and concept off the back of that. And not
Damien
something I
provided
typically recommend.
Damien provided a little bit more context. What are you using to track the total cost off a project from start to completion, which also incorporates cost of having someone work on the project?
Yeah. What are you using to track the total cost off a project from start to completion? Yeah. So we talked about this, Damien, in some of the earlier sessions, but the long and short of this is, if we come back to our model earlier, we have a people grid and we have time data. The cost should be driven off of somebody's total capacity, which is basically 2,080 hours a year. So we have a cost per hour associated with each individual. We stitch that together with time data. That gives us the cost on a project. So that's how we would do project level profitability. And we're typically doing that, again, outside of the time tracking tool, just because time tracking tools tend to be kind of bad at this stuff, or it's another place where we have to go and manually maintain cost per hour data. Although Harvest does like a decent job of this, but I'm just not a huge fan of having to go back and manually update cost values, especially where the modeling in Harvest and a lot of other tools tends to be fairly dumb and naive, in that if we update somebody's cost per hour, it wants to go retroactively apply that change to historicals, even though they might have just gotten a raise that applies today going forward. And so there's some complexity around that that's harder to handle inside of tools. But that's the simple answer. The majority of the cost is going to be labor, and we're really typically focused on gross margin on projects. And I think I talked about that earlier, but we're not looking to get to a net margin number, because it doesn't make sense in my opinion, and it's really, really hard and doesn't give us any additional value. So using the people grid, figuring out the cost per hour, and then stitching that together with time data is the easiest way to do that and get the insight that you're looking for, I think.
Awesome.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Do I have a dashboard with the matrix you explained to get the triggers in place? Mo, could you elaborate a little bit more?
Mo, do you want to drop in the chat a little bit more context and we'll jump to Brandon? I'm not sure if you already answered this, Marcel, in your other explanation, but so far, custom software / app development, we may need to create our own scoping metric for software development. How many large or medium and small features did the client need, for example? And then you also followed up, each size would have its own corresponding value.
Yeah. And Brandon, I'm willing to bet that you're using some form of Agile. And so, yeah, that probably corresponds, or there's some link there where it's like, okay, we have a sense of the features. We can kind of quickly throw t-shirt sizes at those, try to quantify that. And then that is how you start to build a relationship between complexity and effort. So I think that that's a good way to think about it in your case. And then in terms of Mo's question, I just am not 100% sure what the question is, but Mo, if you want to add more context or come on live to ask the question, I'm happy to answer it. While I'm waiting for some context on that, I want to address Cody's question in the chat.
Perfect.
What do you put the time tracking data into then? Spreadsheets? Yes, generally, actually, I love starting with spreadsheets. You can get more elaborate if you want to use some kind of a data management tool. I really believe in using an ETL approach to managing agency data. So let me just explain that really quick. So ETL stands for extract, transform, and load. Okay, so this is not a new concept in data management. It's been around for a long time. The problem with most agency reporting tools, all-in-ones or individual tools, or any kind of automation that I see clients trying to set up for themselves, is that there's no middle step in between the data and the reporting. And so if somebody logs a 99-hour time entry, or they don't tag it correctly, or they don't use the proper naming convention, or the name in the time entry for the project doesn't match exactly to the project name in whatever system you're using to store that, then you end up with all these mistakes in your reporting, and you spend more time in your reports trying to troubleshoot things. And then you end up also having to go and correct source data, which is never a good thing. And it leads to all kinds of problems. So generally what we want to do instead is we have our tools for tracking time. So let's say this is like time tracking, right? We might have a PM tool. We might have an accounting tool, right? So these are our tools. We extract data from these tools into a transformation layer where we transform, clean, and normalize data. And we can also do stitching here as well, which is really powerful. So as an example, I have a lot of clients that they want to do analysis at like a task or subtask or subtask level, right? They're getting very granular in their project management tool. It would be a mistake, in my opinion, to try and implement that hierarchy at the time tracking level, because it's just going to absolutely destroy time tracking compliance. People aren't going to know where to put their time. It's going to be too complicated, too cumbersome. So instead, if we can create a link between a time entry and a project entry, or a task entry in a project management tool using something like a task ID, then we can pull all the tasks, pull all the time entries, and then stitch them together and get all the metadata from the project management tool without actually having to add any of that to the time tracking tool. So that transformation layer is really powerful. And then we take this kind of normalized, clean data, and then we load it into reports. And this approach is helpful for a couple of things. Obviously, it leads to cleaner, more reliable reports. It allows us to have some more control and cleaning over the data. But it also allows us to swap out the time tracking tool, swap out the project management tool, swap out the accounting tool, not lose any of our historical data, not have to deal with changing the entire system. We can start changing pieces of this out without breaking everything. We can start changing our pricing or billing models, changing our team, changing our offerings, and not have it completely break the whole system, because it's all directly linked together. The transformation layer is key because it gives us a whole bunch of flexibility in terms of how the outputs look and where they are, in terms of what the inputs are and what they're structured like, and then gives us the ability to stitch different periods of time together through the middle. So if we go from billing on flat fees to billing by the hour, or if we go from, I don't know, using Harvest to using something else for time tracking, those changes can be made without breaking the entire system, without actually needing a ton of change management. So this is kind of the approach that I recommend people take. And you can totally just do this with spreadsheets, right? You can have a manual process where you export a CSV of time tracking, project management, accounting data, and you pull that into a spreadsheet where you've got your project grid and your payroll grid, and then you stitch all that data together into reporting and do the math. But as you can see, the more complex your modeling becomes, the harder this stuff gets. So if you keep things simple, I think that's a really important thing. So that's a good question, Cody. Hopefully that that helps. And Mo,
Okay,
what I mean
last
is the tool to generate dashboards related to all these KPIs, cost variables, stuff. Yeah, good question, Mo. The short answer is Google Sheets. There is no all-in-one agency management platform or even dashboarding and reporting platform that I've seen that does a great job of this. Although I think you could, like, if you really wanted to use like DataBox or Clipfolio or something like that, you could, but I would use that purely as the reporting environment. You would still need to set up some kind of infrastructure, I believe, for data transformation and data ingress, because most of the reporting systems are going to fall very short on the data cleaning, transformation, normalization side. And oftentimes, the more software you get with the reporting environment, the more limitations you start to run into. Like, this is why we still internally use Google Sheets instead of Google Data Studio, because there's like a whole bunch of limitations to Google Data Studio that are kind of arbitrary. Like, there's a limit on the number of rows you can have in a report. So software is not always better than, just kind of using more consumer level tools, Airtable, Smartsheets, or Google Sheets in our case. So I would say start with Google Sheets or some similar kind of tool until you get everything like very, very clear and working really well. And then you can start to perhaps beautify these things using some kind of a data visualization tool or whatever. And that's the beauty, again, of setting this up initially in an ETL format, is you could start to build more tooled reporting in the background without actually having to go any period of time without having reporting. Those two things can go in parallel. And then it's just a question of swapping the destination to, let's call it like a data box or Clipfolio, for example, or Google Data Studio. I think we might be over time. Hopefully that's been helpful. Mo, that's a great question.
Okay, thank you so much, Marcel. This was workshop number 6. It was amazing. I just want to remind everyone about the ebook. It's coming out, all of his spices, herbs and spices, because that's fun to say. Thank you everyone for attending, and massive shout out to Marcel from me, from Vish, from Vendasta, to providing all these insights. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone have a great day. It's Tuesday. It's not Monday. It's Tuesday. Thank you. See ya.